Okay, so hopefully you found that video interesting, explaining at least some of the details of things that can be looked for, but also explaining the difficulty of applying those things. So let's move on to social cognition and talk about how we form inferences from social information in the environment. Social cognition is a whole field that combines social psychology and cognitive psychology. The one thing that is really super important in this field is this ability that we have to draw inferences. That's another way of saying sort of making guesses or jumping to conclusions based on limited information. Inferences are usually going to be based on previous experience, your knowledge base, things like that. Not necessarily based on what exactly is going on right now with this person, but instead, or in this group, but instead is based on your storehouse of knowledge and experience. So let's talk a little bit about what is social cognition versus what is non-social cognition. So there are a couple similarities. One is that no matter whether you are thinking about social things or you're thinking about non-social things, you are always what we call cognitive misers, where, like I've been saying, you'd rather be quick than right. You don't really want to expend a lot of cognitive effort making a judgment. Your world is full of so many judgments to make all the time. You can't be bogging down trying to get every single detail so that every single thing is always right. A lot of times it doesn't matter if you were right or wrong. You're moving on with your life anyway, right? Like it doesn't have any big impact. But meanwhile, you're forming your framework for how the world works by all these inferences that you're drawing. So you don't like to spend a lot of information on it. Both of these kinds of cognitions occur inside of the black box of your brain, so we can't directly watch these kinds of cognitions occurring, whether they're social or they're non-social. So we have to figure out some way to get people to display the cognitions that they're having out in the world so we can measure them and record them and, allow us to know what people are doing when they're making these inferences. So some differences between them. Social cognition is the more hot cognition, as in it involves more emotion. There's more threat, there's more gratification, there's just a lot more emotion going on with the cognitions that you make that relate to social questions. So emotion, another word for that is affect, right? There's more affect involved, more happiness, more sadness, more fear, more, pleasure. There's just more. It's more hot in the sense that you're more motivated to do it. If you think about social cognitions, you're making judgments about people or you're making judgments about a situation. With a non-social cognition, you're talking about, categorizing objects or, doing mathematical problems, things like that. And it's like, people may not be that motivated to do the non-social ones, but they tend to be very motivated to make judgments in a social world. It's more hot also because it pertains to social norms. So there's like this overarching sense of, right or wrong, appropriate or inappropriate. That's part of that, makes it a much more sort of edgy, risk-filled kind of thing to be making social cognitions. Social cognition involves even more inferences than regular cognition does, because a lot of times with regular cognition, there are rules that you may have learned when you were younger that you can just apply in any circumstance. So, for example, mathematical rules or grammatical rules. I just had a very protracted discussion this morning about whether it is grammatically appropriate to say that that person has more nerve than me, or should it be more nerve than I? And so we had to go through all the rules of grammar to figure out why. I knew me was correct, but I couldn't explain it, which was making my conversational partner suspicious of my knowledge. So we had to look it up. And ultimately, if it comes after the verb, it's probably supposed to be me. Like if the verb is right. So the other person has, that's the verb, more nerve than me would be the correct form of the personal, right? There are rules for that. And how many of you fell asleep while I was explaining this very interesting thing that I did this morning? You were not that motivated to hear the results of the grammatical rule application, right? That's those non-social cognitions are not that motivating to have, right? Social cognition is more motivating, and it involves you jumping to more conclusions. A lot of times the things that we're making inferences about in social settings, there aren't rules that you can just blatantly apply. I mean, that's the thing about humans, right? You don't have a strict set of rules that you can just apply to all humans, or all, male versus female humans, or all older versus younger, or anything, right? There are no rules. So you have to make a lot more inferences and rely a lot less on rules. One of the things that makes it more complex is that, let's say I'm starting to develop a rule about Fred, who I've seen, we recently met. I've seen across, class time, office hours, and, a lab meeting, because he's joining my lab, let's say. So I've seen him across 3 different contexts, as a learner, as a person who's, coming to me for help, and then as a person who's potentially going to help in my research. His behavior might be different because across those 3 situations, because the situations demand different behavior. His behavior might be different because class meets in the morning and he's not a morning person, as opposed to the lab meeting was in the afternoon, right? It could be that when he came to see me in my office hours, he was really upset about his performance on an exam, but now I'm seeing at the lab meeting, he's really excited about embarking on this lab research. Right? Like, people can be really changeable for lots of different reasons. And so it makes it really difficult to apply rules. Another issue about the need for inferences is that we can't directly observe the source of the individual's behavior. We can observe their behavior when they're drawing inferences, but we can't necessarily directly see why they drew that inference. We can see, so in an experiment, let's say we could set it up so that we have a confederate who behaves in a certain way, and then we have the participant who we're interested in their inferences that they might be drawing about the confederate, who they think is another member of the, just another participant. It's possible that our participant will express certain inferences that they drew, but we don't know whether those inferences are strictly due to their exposure to this confederate, or if their inferences are a combination of their previous experiences with other people like this confederate, or if these inferences are being drawn in part due to their own state within themselves. Maybe they were really hungry, or just got into an argument with somebody right before they came to participate. We don't know what factors all went into those inferences. All we can see is that our confederate acted like this and our participant made this inference. That's all we know. It's really difficult to know why they drew that inference. Like I was talking about in the previous lecture, we try and manage our self-presentations that people will perceive us the way that we want. And because of that, all of us researchers in this area know that the participants may not be behaving naturally. They might be behaving in a way to manage our perception of them. Might be behaving in a socially desirable way, for example. Or they might be behaving in a non-conformist way because they don't want you to think that they're conformists, even though they're not. Their knee-jerk gut reaction is to behave in a way that would have been very conformist, but then they're like, whoa, I don't want you to think that about me, so I'm going to do the direct opposite. Just do the opposite. I'm going to do the opposite, right? Because they're perceiving us back, that they're getting those mirror reflections, right? So that our reactions to them may impact the way that they're behaving. So if a person's having a natural response and let's say our brow furrows, they might moderate that response and say, oh, apparently I'm saying something inappropriate, or I'm being judged for it, so let me moderate what I just said, right? And so their inferences may not be pure. In the same vein, people have to draw inferences in social cognition because as we're drawing inferences about other people, they're inferring about us, and it's a back and forth, and that alters our inferences. And so it's a complex dance. It's not just applying a rule, that's for sure. All right. So I keep saying that we'd rather be quick than right. One of the ways to be quick is to simplify our cognitions. So what do we normal actors out in the world do to make it easier on ourselves to draw inferences and have social cognitions. One thing is that we rely on our biases, our pre-existing beliefs, our prior expectancies. We use a lot of automatic processing. I'm kind of going through these quickly because I've already beaten the biases to death, haven't I? I've talked a lot about prior expectancies. I just got done in earlier part of this chapter talking about automatic processing. Let's illustrate automatic processing. I don't think it would take you very long to count to 10. I'm going to say, you probably could do it while I just said count to 10. Because that's an automatic process for you. It has become such a well-rehearsed response that you can count to 10 without any effort or thought, and you can do it very quickly, right? Something that might take a little bit more effort would be if I were to ask you to alphabetize the counting words 1 to 10. So you have to figure out which one has what's the correct term for it? Like the lowest letter is what I want to say, closest to A. And then, okay, which one has right? And you go through until you get done with all the letters. What's really weird is I've tried to do this kind of demonstration off the top of my head. And what's really weird is how often you misalphabetize because the pronunciation of the word makes you think it belongs in a different spot. It's a really effortful task to deliberately alphabetize the counting words. So if you could kind of compare out in the world, judging the sex of a person or the formidability of a person, it would be the same to you as like counting to 10. Whereas assessing whether a person is lying to you or a person is fundamentally nice or something like that, that would be more like alphabetizing the counting words. Because counting to 10 is automatic, alphabetizing is effortful. All right, another thing that we do to simplify cognitions is that we will try and suppress thoughts that we don't want to have interfering with whatever we're doing right now. So you guys have all seen courtroom dramas where they tell the jury to ignore that last statement, and we all know full well that that's the one thing the jury's going to remember from this entire trial. Trying to suppress your thoughts is pretty difficult. Once it's crossed your mind, the more effort you put into keeping it from crossing your mind again, the more likely it is to actually get stored away in memory and you actually will remember it in the long run. Now I have a picture of a polar bear because there was a study conducted where they said, okay, so for the rest of this study, we don't want you to think about white bears. Don't think about white bears at all. If you find yourself thinking about a white bear, I want you to raise your hand and we'll write it down and then, go back to business and stop thinking about white bears. And what they found is that every single person raised their hand at some point during the study because that stinking white bear came into mind. I'm not supposed to be thinking about it. I wouldn't have been thinking about a white bear if you hadn't told me. Who thinks about polar bears in their normal, everyday life normally? You're here to participate in a study. Why would you have thought about a polar bear? Except for that they said, don't think about polar bears. And so that little constrained, stupid, don't think about white bears example shows us that if we have difficulty suppressing a thought of a white bear, think how difficult it would be to suppress thoughts of negativity about somebody who you're sitting there with, right? That maybe you've got a past with, or they remind you of somebody who you have a past with that is associated with negativity or something like that. Think how hard it would be to not be thinking those thoughts. I mean, it pops into your head unbidden all the time. Thought suppression is what we tend to try to use, and it's the worst. It's really difficult to implement thought suppression. I actually did some research on being able to recall things that you didn't think you ever needed to recall again. And it turns out that if you think that you might be someday needing this information again, it's much more likely to pop up in your memory later on. Even up to a month later, I've tested it. Whereas if you think you're done with it and you didn't care about it in the first place, none of it mattered anyway, you really won't remember it a month later. So the fact that you're actively trying not to think about it tells your brain, this must be really important because you keep thinking about it. You keep telling me not to think about it. That makes me think it must be important. So thought suppression is not your best bet. Now, if you've had personality theory and you're familiar with Freudian terminology, you might think that sounds a lot like repression, and it does. Social psychologists don't want to say things that sound like Freudian, so they came up with their own term for it. All right. So let's go ahead and take a break here, and we'll talk about how efficiency trumps accuracy, and I'll give you some great examples. So I will see you in the next video.